Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now, let's start. The cold spring air carried the scent of salt and fear as dawn broke over the coastal monastery of Lindisfarne. Candlelight flickered through the small windows as monks prepared for morning prayers, unaware that death sailed toward them on dragon-headed ships. Celine Jarrett knelt before the modest altar, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her mother's silver cross. At 20 summers, she was neither nun nor peasant, but the educated daughter of a wealthy merchant who had left her in the monastery's care while he traveled south to trade. 6 months had passed since his departure, twice as long as promised, and the whispers of coastal raids grew more frequent with each passing day. "Your father will return soon," Brother Elfric assured her, his aged hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "The spring winds bring traders back to our shores." "And raiders," Celine replied softly, tucking a strand of chestnut hair beneath her linen head covering. "The villagers speak of nothing else." The old monk's face tightened. "God protects his faithful." But God seemed distant when the horn sounded from the watchtower. The single, urgent blast cut through the morning stillness, followed by the frantic ringing of the monastery bell. Celine rushed to the window in time to see 3 longships, their carved prows slicing through the mist like serpents, bearing down on the small harbor. "Vikings," Brother Elfric whispered, his face ashen. "Quickly, child! To the secret chamber with the others." But Celine never reached the hiding place beneath the chapel floor. The monastery doors splintered beneath Norse axes before the women could be safely concealed. The screams began as warriors poured into the sacred space, their bearded faces fierce beneath iron helmets, their arms ringed with silver bands that caught the morning light. Celine pressed herself against the cold stone wall, watching in horror as monks fell beneath Norse swords. She clutched her mother's cross so tightly the edges cut into her palm. When a towering warrior turned toward her, his blue eyes finding hers across the chaos, she knew her life was about to change forever. Thorfinn Wolfson stood apart from the other raiders. Not just in height, though he towered over most men, but in the quiet authority that surrounded him like an invisible cloak. His long hair, the color of burnished gold, was bound at his nape with a leather thong, and his beard was shorter than those of his companions. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, a testament to battle survived. But it was his eyes that held Celine transfixed, blue as a winter sky and just as cold. He approached her with deliberate steps, studying her as one might inspect a curious artifact. His men continued their plunder around them, but Celine saw only this warrior, this warlord whose presence seemed to fill the space between them. "You are not a nun," he said in accented but clear Saxon. The sound of the enemy's tongue from his lips startled her almost as much as the observation itself. Celine lifted her chin, determined not to show fear despite the trembling in her limbs. "I am a merchant's daughter." A flash of interest crossed his face. He reached out, and she flinched, but he merely touched the silver cross at her throat. "Valuable." "Only to me," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was my mother's." The Viking's calloused fingers released the cross, but his gaze remained on her face. "What is your name?" "Celine Jarrett." "Celine," he repeated, the syllables strange on his tongue. Then, without warning, he called out in his own language. Another warrior approached, this one younger with dark hair and a clean-shaven face that marked him as barely past boyhood. "Bring her," Thorfinn commanded, switching back to Saxon so she would understand. "She will fetch a good price, or perhaps a valuable ransom." The younger Viking grasped her arm, his grip firm but not cruel. As he led her from the monastery, Celine looked back once to see Brother Elfric's body crumpled near the altar, blood staining his robes. She closed her eyes against the sight, knowing the God he served had not protected him after all. Outside, the village burned. Women wailed as children were torn from their arms, men lay slain in doorways, and livestock was herded toward the shore. The Norsemen worked with efficient brutality, selecting captives and goods with practiced eyes. Those deemed too old or troublesome were dispatched with swift sword strokes. At the beach, Celine was forced into the largest of the 3 longships, where other captives, mostly young women and a few skilled craftsmen, huddled together, their faces masks of terror. She found herself seated near the stern, close to where Thorfinn would command the vessel. As the raiders pushed the ships back into the sea, Selene watched her homeland recede. The monastery stood on its cliff, smoke billowing from its windows like black prayers rising to an indifferent heaven. She touched her mother's cross and made a silent vow she would survive, and someday she would return. The journey north was a nightmare of cold sea spray, cramped quarters, and the constant fear that hung over the captives like a shroud. Days blended into nights as the oarsmen drove the ships through waters that grew increasingly rough. Some captives wept, others stared with vacant eyes at the endless horizon. 2 died, an elderly craftsman whose heart gave out and a young woman who, in her despair, threw herself into the icy waters when the guards weren't looking. Selene survived by watching and learning. She observed how the Vikings navigated by sun and stars, how they coordinated the rhythm of their oars, how they spoke to one another with a rough camaraderie that suggested kinship beyond blood. And always, she watched Thorfinn, the warlord whose word was law aboard the ship. He rarely acknowledged her presence, except when food was distributed. Then, inexplicably, he would ensure she received a fair portion, sometimes even adding a piece of dried apple or extra bread to her share. Once, when a bearded raider tried to touch her hair, Thorfinn's voice had cut through the sea air like a blade. "She is untouched goods," he had said in his own tongue, which Selene was beginning to understand in fragments. "Her value lies in her condition when we return." The man had withdrawn his hand as though burned, and none had approached her since. On the 7th day, land appeared on the horizon, a rugged coastline of rocky cliffs and dense forests that rose from the sea like the backbone of some great beast. As they drew closer, Selene saw smoke rising from settlements nestled in protected coves, and smaller boats venturing out to greet the returning raiders. They landed near a substantial village, where wooden buildings clustered around a central hall with a high, pitched roof. People poured from the settlement, women, children, and old men who had remained behind during the raid. They called out greetings, embracing the returning warriors and eyeing the plunder with eager anticipation. The captives were herded onto the shore, shivering in the chill northern air. Selene stood apart from the others, her back straight despite her exhaustion. She would not be broken by fear, not when survival demanded strength. Thorfinn strode through the crowd, accepting congratulations from his people with dignified nods. When he reached the captives, he spoke to the man who had guarded them during the journey. "Take them to the slave quarters. Tomorrow we will decide their fates." His gaze fell on Selene last, lingering just long enough for her to wonder what thoughts moved behind those ice-blue eyes. Then he turned away, heading toward the great hall as a slender woman with hair like pale wheat rushed to greet him. The slave quarters proved to be a long, low building with a dirt floor and narrow sleeping platforms along the walls. There was a central hearth but little wood for fire, and the captives huddled together for warmth as night fell. In whispers, they shared what little they knew of their captors. "The Northmen take slaves to work their farms," said a craftsman from Selene's village. "Or they sell them to traders from the east. The pretty ones become concubines," added an older woman, her eyes hollow with the knowledge of what might await them. Selene thought of Thorfinn and the pale woman who had greeted him so warmly. His wife, perhaps? Or merely one of many women who shared his bed? The thought stirred an unexpected emotion that she quickly suppressed. It mattered not who warmed the warlord's furs. She was a captive, nothing more, and her only concern should be survival. Yet when she finally fell into exhausted sleep, it was Thorfinn's face that haunted her dreams, not as the fierce raider who had torn her from her home, but as something more complex, a man whose cold eyes sometimes held unexpected warmth when they rested upon her. The next morning, the captives were brought to the great hall for inspection. Thorfinn sat in a carved chair on a raised platform, surrounded by what appeared to be the village elders and prominent warriors. The pale woman stood at his side, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. One by one, the captives were evaluated. Some were claimed by warriors as their share of the plunder. Others were designated for household work or craft labor. A few were set aside for trading with merchants from distant lands. When Selene's turn came, she lifted her chin and met Thorfinn's gaze directly, refusing to show submission even as her heart hammered in her chest. "This one has spirit," remarked an older warrior, his beard streaked with grey. and beauty enough to fetch a good price in Miklagard. She is the daughter of a Saxon merchant, Thorfinn replied. Her father may pay handsomely for her return. The pale woman leaned down to whisper in his ear, her eyes narrowing as she studied Selene. Whatever she said caused a flicker of irritation to cross Thorfinn's face. No, Jida, he said firmly. She will not be sold eastward. I claim her as part of my share. A murmur ran through the assembled Vikings. Jida's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing more, her fingers tightening on Thorfinn's shoulder. The Saxon girl will serve in my household, Thorfinn announced, his tone brooking no argument. Until her ransom is arranged or until I decide otherwise. And so began Selene's life among the Northmen. She was taken to Thorfinn's longhouse, a spacious dwelling near the Great Hall. Unlike the other slaves who slept in outbuildings, she was given a small alcove near the main hearth, separated from the rest of the house by a woven curtain. The space contained a narrow bed filled with straw and covered with woolen blankets, a small wooden chest for her few possessions, and a three-legged stool. Thorfinn's household included several servants, some free, some enslaved, and was overseen by an older woman named Hilda, whose stern efficiency kept the longhouse running smoothly. It was Hilda who explained Selene's duties. She would assist in food preparation, tend the fire, help with weaving, and serve at Thorfinn's table when he entertained guests. You are fortunate, Hilda told her in halting Saxon. Thorfinn Wolfson is a fair master. Some slaves are not so lucky. I am not a slave, Selene replied, though she knew her defiance was merely words. I am a captive awaiting ransom. Hilda gave her a pitying look. Many begin that way. Few return home. The day settled into a routine. Selene worked from dawn until dusk, learning the ways of her captors through observation and the limited instruction Hilda provided. She discovered that Viking women enjoyed more freedom than their Saxon counterparts. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and even participate in some aspects of governance. Yet they were still expected to manage households, produce children, and defer to male authority in matters of war and trade. Thorfinn himself remained an enigma. He spent many days away from the longhouse, attending to whatever duties a warlord performed in times of peace. When he was present, he largely ignored Selene, speaking to her only when necessary and always with the cool detachment of a man addressing property rather than a person. Only occasionally did she glimpse something different in his manner, a moment when his gaze lingered on her hands as she poured his mead, or when he instructed Hilda to ensure Selene had proper clothing for the increasingly cold weather. Jida visited often, her presence filling the longhouse with tension. She was, Selene learned from whispered conversations among the servants, the daughter of a powerful jarl from a neighboring settlement. A marriage between her and Thorfinn had been discussed for years, but never formalized. Still, she behaved as though the union were inevitable, and regarded Selene with thinly veiled hostility. Why does she hate me so? Selene asked Hilda one evening as they prepared the evening meal. I am just a captive. Hilda glanced toward the door to ensure they were alone. Jida sees how Thorfinn looks at you when he thinks no one notices. She fears you threaten her position. That's absurd, Selene protested, though her heart quickened at the suggestion. He barely acknowledges my existence. There are many ways a man can show interest, Hilda replied cryptically. Why do you think you sleep near his hearth while other slaves shiver in the outbuildings? Why does he ensure you have the finest food and warmest clothing? Because I'm valuable as a ransom, Selene insisted. Hilda smiled knowingly. If ransom were his only concern, he would have sent messengers to your father already. It has been nearly 2 moons since the raid, yet no word has been dispatched southward. The realization struck Selene like a physical blow. Was it possible Thorfinn had no intention of returning her? And if not for ransom, then for what purpose did he keep her close? That night, as she served at Thorfinn's table where he dined with several warriors, she studied him with new awareness. He was discussing plans for the winter, stores to be laid in, repairs to be made to the longships, training for younger warriors. His voice was deep and measured, his manner that of a man accustomed to command yet willing to consider the counsel of trusted advisers. When he caught her watching him, he held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before returning to the conversation. That brief connection sent a shiver through Celine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill seeping through the wooden walls. Later, as she cleared away the remains of the meal, he addressed her directly for the first time in days. "You understand our language better now," he observed, switching to Saxon for her benefit. Celine nodded. "I listen. I learn." "Good. Knowledge is a weapon, and the wise acquire as many weapons as possible." He studied her face in the firelight. "Are you wise, Celine Jarrett?" "Wise enough to know I am still a captive, no matter how comfortable my cage," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Instead of anger, his response was a slight curve of his lips, not quite a smile, but close. "A captive, yes. But not without value beyond the silver your father might pay." "What value?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He rose from his seat, towering over her. For a moment, she thought he might touch her, and some treacherous part of her hoped he would. Instead, he merely said, "That remains to be seen," before striding from the hall, leaving her with questions that burned hotter than the hearth fire. The autumn deepened into early winter. Snow dusted the settlement, transforming the rugged landscape into something ethereally beautiful. Celine found herself adapting to life among the Northmen more easily than she had expected. She learned their language more fluently, observed their customs, and even began to appreciate certain aspects of their culture, their love of poetry and storytelling, their craftsmanship, their deep connection to the natural world. She also learned more about Thorfinn. From servants' gossip and overheard conversations, she pieced together his story. He was the younger son of a powerful Jarl who had died in battle against rival Danes. His older brother had inherited the title, but Thorfinn had proven himself the more capable warrior and leader. When his brother fell ill and died 3 winters past, Thorfinn had taken control of their settlement and expanded its influence through both conquest and strategic alliances. The proposed marriage to Jida was one such alliance, a union that would join 2 strong settlements and potentially create the most powerful holding in the region. Yet Thorfinn seemed in no hurry to finalize the arrangement, despite Jida's increasingly obvious attempts to hasten the decision. One evening, as the first serious snowfall of winter blanketed the settlement, Celine was alone in the longhouse, tending the fire while Hilda and the other servants attended a celebration in the great hall. Thorfinn had gone hunting earlier that day and had not yet returned. When the door finally opened, admitting a blast of cold air, she looked up expecting to see Hilda. Instead, Thorfinn entered, stamping snow from his boots and shaking it from his cloak. His face was reddened from the cold, his hair dusted with snowflakes that melted in the sudden warmth. "You did not attend the feast," he said, hanging his cloak on a peg near the door. "I was not invited," Celine replied. "Slaves do not feast with free folk. You are not an ordinary slave." He approached the fire, extending his hands toward the flames. In the flickering light, the scar on his face seemed less harsh, more a mark of experience than violence. "What am I then?" she asked, emboldened by their solitude. He regarded her thoughtfully. "A puzzle. A woman of education and refinement who adapts to captivity with dignity rather than despair. Who learns our language and ways without losing her own identity." He reached out, and this time he did touch her, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "A treasure more valuable than the silver and gold we took from your homeland." Celine's breath caught at his touch. "Is that why you've sent no ransom demand to my father?" "Because you consider me treasure to be hoarded." A shadow crossed his face. "Your father cannot respond to demands he does not receive." "What do you mean?" Thorfinn sighed, lowering himself onto a bench near the fire. "Word reached us through traders 3 weeks ago. Your father's ship was lost in a storm off the Frisian coast last winter. There is no one to pay your ransom, Celine." The news hit her like a physical blow. She sank onto the bench beside him, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "My father is dead? All this time, I've been waiting for a rescue that could never come." "I'm sorry," he said, and the genuine regret in his voice surprised her. "I should have told you sooner, but I did not wish to cause you pain." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her father had been her only family, her last connection to the life she had known. With him gone, what remained for her in England? The monastery that had sheltered her would expect payment she could not provide. She would be alone, adrift in a world that offered few options for a woman without protection. "What happens to me now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Thorfinn's blue eyes held hers. "That depends on you. You could remain as you are, a valued servant in my household. Or, she prompted when he fell silent. Or you could become something more." He spoke the words carefully, as though testing dangerous ground. "You have seen our ways. Women here can hold property, conduct trade, have voice in council. As he hesitated, searching for the right word. As my companion, you would have status, protection." Selene stared at him in disbelief. "Are you offering to make me your concubine?" "I offer you a place at my side," he corrected. "Not as wife, that position must be filled by political necessity, but as one who shares my hearth and bed by choice rather than compulsion." "Choice," she repeated, anger flaring within her. "What choice does a captive have?" He flinched slightly at her tone. "More than you might think. I would not force you, Selene. If you refuse, your position here remains unchanged. You will be treated with respect, given meaningful work, perhaps eventually granted freedom when you have earned it through service." "And if I accept," she challenged, "what becomes of me when you tire of my company and marry Jida, as everyone expects?" "You would retain your status," he assured her. "Your own dwelling, servants, a place of honor in the settlement." "Until your wife demands my removal," Selene countered. "I have seen how Jida looks at me. She would not tolerate my presence once she wears your ring." Thorfinn's expression hardened. "Jida does not command me. No woman does, not even one who shares my bed." "Then perhaps no woman should," Selene retorted, rising from the bench. "You offer me a choice between servitude and concubinage, calling it freedom. I see little difference." She turned away, expecting anger, perhaps even punishment for her defiance. Instead, she heard him laugh, a low, appreciative sound that drew her eyes back to his face. "This is why you fascinate me," he said, rising to stand before her. "Any other captive would accept without hesitation, grateful for improved circumstances. But you demand real choice, real respect." His voice softened. "I admire that, Selene Jarrett. More than I should." Before she could respond, the door opened again, admitting Hilda and 2 other servants returning from the feast. The moment shattered, leaving Selene with tumultuous emotions and unanswered questions. That night, lying on her narrow bed behind the woven curtain, she tried to make sense of her feelings. She should hate Thorfinn, the man who had torn her from her home, who had killed or enslaved people she had known, who now offered her a position that was little more than glorified servitude. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw not the fierce raider of their first meeting, but the man who had spoken to her by the fire. A man who, despite his strength and power, seemed to value her mind as much as her beauty. A man whose touch had awakened sensations she had never experienced before. Was it possible to find connection with someone so fundamentally opposed to everything she had been raised to believe? Could there be honor in a warrior culture that celebrated raiding and conquest? And most troubling of all, could she be developing feelings for her captor? Sleep eluded her as these questions circled in her mind like restless spirits, offering no peace and no answers. The winter deepened, transforming the northern landscape into a realm of ice and snow. The settlement turned inward during these months, focusing on survival and community. Days grew shorter, nights longer, and much of life centered around the hearth fires that provided both warmth and light. Selene neither accepted nor explicitly rejected Thorfinn's offer. Instead, an unspoken understanding developed between them. Her status in the household subtly shifted, she was given fewer menial tasks and more responsibilities that utilized her literacy and intelligence. Thorfinn began to consult her on matters related to trade with southern lands, valuing her knowledge of Saxon customs and commerce. Their interactions grew more frequent, more personal. Sometimes in the evenings, when the household had settled for the night, they would sit by the fire and talk. He told her of his childhood, of learning to navigate by stars, of his first raid at 14 summers. She shared stories of her merchant father, of the books she had read in the monastery, of her dreams to someday travel to distant lands. "You are doing that now," he pointed out one night. "Though perhaps not as you imagined." "No," she agreed with a small smile. "Being captured by Vikings was not part of my plan." "Life rarely follows our plans," he said, his expression thoughtful. "My father planned for my brother to lead our people. Fate decided otherwise." "Do you believe in fate?" she asked. "That our paths are predetermined by gods or wyrd?" "I believe in making one's own fate," he replied. "But I also believe some meetings are destined." His eyes held hers in the firelight. "Like ours." The intensity of his gaze made her heart race. More and more, she found herself drawn to him, to his strength, his intelligence, his unexpected gentleness. Yet each time these feelings surfaced, she reminded herself of who and what he was, a Viking warlord who had built his reputation on raiding and conquest. A man whose culture was fundamentally opposed to her own. Jaida's visits became more frequent and more pointed. She would arrive unannounced, often bringing gifts for Thorfinn, finely woven textiles, specially brewed mead, occasionally exotic items acquired through her father's trading connections. Each visit was a performance intended to demonstrate her value as a potential wife, and each included cutting remarks or dismissive glances directed at Celine. "The Saxon girl seems comfortable," she observed during one such visit, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Almost as though she has forgotten her place." "Celine knows her value in this household," Thorfinn replied coolly. "As should everyone who enters it." The rebuke was clear, and Jaida's face flushed with anger. Later, as Celine helped clear away the remains of the meal they had shared, Jaida cornered her near the storage room. "Do not think your position here is secure," she hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. "Thorfinn may find you amusing now, but when we are wed, you will be sold to the Eastern traders or given to one of his warriors as a bed slave." Celine met her gaze steadily. "If Thorfinn wished to wed you, he would have done so already. Perhaps you should consider why he hesitates." It was a dangerous provocation, but Celine was tired of Jaida's threats. The Nordic woman's eyes widened in fury, and for a moment, Celine thought she might strike her. Instead, Jaida leaned closer, her voice a venomous whisper. "My father controls 3 settlements and 20 longships. Thorfinn needs our alliance to maintain his power. He will wed me before spring, and when he does, I will make certain you suffer for your insolence." With that, she swept away, leaving Celine shaken despite her outward composure. The encounter made her realize how precarious her position truly was. Whatever regard Thorfinn held for her, political necessity might indeed force him into an alliance with Jaida's family. And then what would become of her? That night, when Thorfinn returned from a council meeting in the Great Hall, she approached him directly. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice low enough that the other servants couldn't hear. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Walk with me." He led her outside, where the night air was crisp and clear. Stars glittered like ice crystals in the black sky, and their breath formed clouds in the cold. He draped an extra fur around her shoulders without comment, and they walked toward the shore, where the frozen fjord stretched like a silver path into the darkness. "Jaida threatened me today," Celine said when they were beyond earshot of the settlement. "She says you will marry her before spring, and when you do, she will ensure I am sold eastward or given to one of your warriors." Thorfinn's expression hardened. "Jaida speaks beyond her authority." "But not beyond the realm of possibility," Celine pressed. "You yourself said the marriage was a political necessity." He stopped walking, turning to face her. In the starlight, his features were sharper, more defined. "There are other alliances that could be made. Other ways to secure our position." "Then why have you allowed her to believe this union is inevitable?" His jaw tightened. "Politics among our people is complex. Her father is powerful, yes, but also aging. His hold on his territories weakens while mine strengthens. The balance shifts." He paused, his eyes searching her face. And there are other considerations now. What considerations? She asked, though something in his expression made her suspect the answer. Instead of replying directly, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with unexpected tenderness. You asked once what value I saw in you beyond ransom. I have shown you, have I not? You advise me on matters of trade. You help me understand the Saxon mind. You? He hesitated, then continued more softly, you bring something to my hall that has been absent. A different kind of strength. Celine's heart thundered in her chest. I am still your captive. Are you? He challenged. The door stands unbarred. The shore lies before you. If you truly wish to flee, opportunities have not been lacking. The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. She had indeed considered escape in those first weeks, had even identified potential routes and times when guards were less vigilant. Yet as winter deepened and her position in the household evolved, those plans had receded from her thoughts. Was it merely the practical recognition that escape in winter would likely mean death? Or was it something else, something she was afraid to acknowledge even to herself? If I tried to leave, you would hunt me down, she said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. But not for the reasons you think. His hand moved from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his touch warm against her skin. Not as property to be reclaimed, but as something I am not prepared to lose. The confession hung between them in the frigid air. Celine knew she should pull away, should remind herself of all the reasons this attraction was wrong. He was her captor, an enemy of her people, a man whose way of life was built on violence and conquest. Yet when he lowered his head and his lips met hers, she did not resist. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, her hands rising to rest against his chest, it deepened into something that sent heat coursing through her despite the winter cold. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Thorfinn rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that since I first saw you in that monastery, he confessed, standing defiant while others cowered. I hated you then, she whispered. And now, he asked, vulnerability evident in his voice despite his strength. Celine closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions within her. Now I don't know what I feel. You've taken everything from me, in my home, my freedom, my future. Yet you've also given me possibilities I never imagined. He stepped back slightly, his hands moving to her shoulders. I cannot change the past, Celine. I cannot undo the raid or the deaths that resulted from it. That is our way, has been for generations. But the future. His eyes held hers intently. The future is unwritten. And I find myself wanting to write it differently because of you. Before she could respond, a horn sounded from the settlement, 3 short blasts that cut through the night air with urgent clarity. Thorfinn's posture changed instantly, tension replacing intimacy. Riders approaching, he explained, already turning toward the village. At night, in winter, this is not a social call. They hurried back, the moment between them suspended but not forgotten. As they neared the settlement, Celine could see torches illuminating the arrival of several mounted men, their horses steaming in the cold air. The newcomers were warriors from a neighboring settlement, their urgent message delivered in rapid Norse that Celine struggled to follow. She gathered enough to understand the situation was grave, something about Danish longships sighted near the southern fjords, unusual movement suggesting a potential attack. Thorfinn issued orders immediately, his voice calm but authoritative. Messengers were dispatched to allied settlements. Warriors were instructed to prepare weapons and armor. Supplies were to be inventoried, defenses strengthened. They would attack in winter. Celine asked when the initial flurry of activity subsided. It is unexpected, Thorfinn acknowledged, his mind clearly already occupied with strategic considerations. Which makes it clever. Our people are scattered in winter settlements, our longships frozen in ice. If they have found a way to navigate the winter seas. He didn't need to finish the thought. The danger was obvious. The following days brought a flurry of preparations. The settlement transformed from a winter-bound community to a fortification preparing for possible siege. Thorfinn was rarely at the Longhouse, spending most of his time in council with other leaders or inspecting defenses. When they did see each other, the intimacy of that night by the fjord seemed distant, overshadowed by the looming threat. Yet occasionally, Celine would catch him watching her with an expression that reminded her of his confession in the starlight, and her heart would quicken despite her attempts to focus on practical matters. Hilda, observing more than she commented upon, assigned Celine to inventory and organize medical supplies. "You have knowledge of healing herbs from your time in the monastery," she explained. "If fighting comes, we will need such skills." The task kept Celine busy and gave her a sense of purpose beyond her usual duties. She worked alongside Viking women who, despite initial suspicion, came to respect her knowledge and efficiency. For the first time since her capture, she felt something approaching belonging. 10 days after the warning arrived, scouts reported Danish ships navigating the partially frozen fjords using methods not previously seen, specialized hulls reinforced against ice, teams of men breaking paths through frozen sections. Their approach was slow but determined, and their numbers significant. That evening, Thorfinn summoned the settlement's free men and women to the Great Hall. Standing before them, illuminated by torchlight, he cut an imposing figure, the Warlord in his element, preparing his people for battle. "The Danes come with 20 ships and perhaps 1,000 warriors," he announced without preamble. "They seek to claim our lands while they believe us vulnerable. They will find instead that even in winter, Norse wolves have teeth." A roar of approval met his words. He outlined the defense strategy, how they would use the winter terrain to their advantage, how allied settlements would coordinate their forces, how even those not trained as warriors could contribute to the settlement's protection. Celine, standing at the back of the hall with other servants, was struck by the difference between this gathering and the council she had observed in England. Here, women voiced opinions alongside men. Elders were respected for their wisdom, but younger voices with valuable insights were also heard. The discussion was sometimes heated but never chaotic, and Thorfinn guided it with a natural authority that seemed to draw more from respect than fear. As the meeting concluded, he sought her out, drawing her aside while others filed from the hall. "Tomorrow I ride to coordinate with our allies," he said without preamble. "I may be gone several days." Celine nodded, trying to ignore the knot of worry that formed in her stomach at his words. "Be careful," she said simply. His expression softened. "What we began that night by the fjord, it is not forgotten, Celine. When this threat has passed, we will speak of it again." "If we survive," she said, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "We will survive." His confidence was unwavering. "The Danes are formidable, but they have miscalculated. This is our land, our weather, our terrain. And we have something worth fighting for." His eyes held hers meaningfully. He left before dawn the next morning, leading a contingent of warriors toward the allied settlement where forces would gather. Celine watched from the doorway of the longhouse as they rode away, snow swirling around them in the grey light of early morning. The days that followed were tense with waiting. Reports arrived sporadically. The Danish force had landed at the southern end of the fjord, they were moving inland, skirmishes had occurred with outlying farmsteads. The settlement prepared for potential siege, gathering livestock within the defensive perimeter, ensuring water supplies were secure, positioning weapons at strategic points. Celine threw herself into preparations, working alongside women who had initially viewed her with suspicion but now accepted her as part of their community. Together they prepared bandages, organized food stores, crafted additional arrows for the settlement's archers. 5 days after Thorfinn's departure, a scout arrived with news that electrified the settlement. The allied Norse forces had engaged the Danish invaders in a narrow valley 2 days' journey south. The battle had been fierce, with heavy losses on both sides, but the defenders had prevailed. The surviving Danes were retreating toward their ships, pursued by Norse warriors. "And Thorfinn?" Celine asked the messenger, her heart in her throat. "Does he live?" The scout nodded. "The Jarl lives, though he took a wound to his shoulder. He leads the pursuit and sends word that the settlement should maintain vigilance. Some Danish forces may have separated from the main group." The warning proved prescient. The very next morning, as a heavy snow began to fall, Lookout spotted a band of perhaps 50 Danish warriors approaching from the west, a contingent that had evidently broken away from the main force to raid undefended settlements while the allied Norse were engaged elsewhere. With most of their warriors away, the settlement faced a desperate situation. The remaining defenders, mostly older men, youths not yet considered full warriors, and women with combat training, quickly organized. Hilda, revealing a previously hidden aspect of her character, took charge with the efficiency of someone who had faced similar situations before. "We are outnumbered," she acknowledged to the assembled defenders, "but we have preparation and position. They must come to us through the snow, up the slope, and over our defenses." The settlement became a hive of controlled activity. Children and the elderly were gathered in the great hall at the center of the village. Those capable of fighting took positions along the defensive perimeter, a combination of wooden palisades, ditches, and natural features enhanced for protection. Celine, despite having no combat training, refused to shelter with the non-combatants. "I can treat wounds," she insisted to Hilda. "And I can carry water, arrows, whatever is needed." Hilda studied her with newfound respect. "Thorfinn saw something in you from the beginning," she said. "Now I understand what." The Danish attack came as the snow intensified, using the reduced visibility as cover. They charged up the slope toward the settlement, shields raised against arrows, their war cries carrying through the snowy air. What followed was chaos and courage intermingled. The defenders fought with the desperation of those protecting home and family. Women wielded bows, spears, and axes alongside men. Youths barely old enough to lift swords stood their ground against seasoned warriors. Celine moved among the defenders, carrying water, bandaging wounds when possible, dragging injured fighters to safer positions. The snow turned red around her, and the air filled with the sounds of combat, metal on metal, shouts of defiance, cries of pain. She was binding a young archer's arm when a section of the defense collapsed under Danish pressure. 3 warriors broke through, cutting down a defender as they charged toward the heart of the settlement. One spotted Celine and changed direction, seeing an undefended target. Terror froze her for an instant as the warrior approached, his axe raised, his bearded face fierce beneath his helmet. Then something shifted within her, a refusal to die helplessly, a determination born of months living among people who valued strength and courage above all. She grabbed a fallen defender's shield, raising it just as the Dane's axe descended. The impact sent shockwaves through her arm, but the shield held. The warrior raised his weapon for another strike, but before he could deliver it, an arrow took him in the throat. He collapsed at Celine's feet, blood spurting from the wound. Hilda stood nearby, already knocking another arrow. "Get to the hall," she shouted. "We cannot hold them much longer." Celine helped the injured archer to his feet, supporting him as they retreated toward the great hall. Around them, the remaining defenders were falling back in organized fashion, maintaining a fighting line even as they ceded ground. They had nearly reached the hall when Celine heard hoofbeats, many horses approaching fast from the south. Her heart sank, thinking more Danish forces had arrived. Then she heard a familiar war cry, one that had terrified her months ago on an English shore but now filled her with desperate hope. Thorfinn led the returning warriors, charging into the Danish force from behind. Caught between the settlement's defenders and the fresh attackers, the Danes fought ferociously but were quickly overwhelmed. Within moments, the tide had turned, and the invaders were being cut down or surrendering. Celine watched from the steps of the great hall as Thorfinn dismounted in the village center, his left arm bound in a blood-stained bandage but his sword still gripped firmly in his right hand. His gaze swept the battlefield, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. When his eyes found her, something like relief crossed his features before he turned to issue orders to his warriors. The aftermath of battle was a grim business of tending wounds, honoring the dead, and securing prisoners. 17 defenders had fallen, a heavy toll for a small settlement, but far fewer than might have been lost without the timely return of their warriors. Celine worked alongside other women, treating injuries with the knowledge she had gained at the monastery. Hours passed in a blur of blood and bandages, comforting words spoken in a language that no longer felt foreign to her tongue. It was well past midnight when she finally returned to Thorfinn's longhouse, exhausted beyond measure. She found him seated by the fire, his wounded shoulder properly bandaged now, a cup of mead in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his face showing the weariness of battle and forced march. "You fought today," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I defended myself," she corrected, sinking onto a bench opposite him. "And helped where I could. Hilda says you showed great courage. That you refused safety to aid the defenders." Celine shrugged, too tired for false modesty. "It seemed the right thing to do." Thorfinn studied her face in the firelight. Many captives would have welcomed the Danish attack as an opportunity for escape. The thought hadn't even occurred to her, she realized with some surprise. When danger threatened the settlement, threatened Thorfinn's people, her only instinct had been to help defend it. What did that say about where her loyalties now lay? "The Danes would have been unlikely to treat me better than you have," she said, avoiding the deeper implication of his observation. "Is that the only reason you stayed?" Practical calculation. His question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Yet after facing death earlier that day, prevarication seemed pointless. "No," she admitted softly. "That is not the only reason." He set aside his cup and moved to sit beside her on the bench. His good arm slipped around her waist, drawing her against his side. "When I saw the smoke from the settlement as we returned, when I thought you might be in danger." His voice roughened with emotion. "I realized something, Celine." "What?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "That you have become more important to me than alliances, than politics, than the expectations of my people." He turned slightly to face her, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "I began by valuing you as property, as a prize. Now I value you as everything." The words touched something deep within her, breaking through the last barriers of resistance. She had fought her feelings for so long, telling herself it was wrong to care for the man who had taken her freedom, that any warmth between them was merely her mind's way of coping with captivity. But facing death had clarified things. Life was too uncertain, too precious to deny truth out of pride or principle. And the truth was that somewhere between hatred and resignation, she had found something else entirely, something that made her heart race when he entered a room, that made her worry when he rode into danger, that made her feel more alive in captivity than she had ever felt in freedom. "I should hate you," she whispered, her hand rising to touch his bearded cheek. "By all rights, by all logic, I should despise everything you represent." "And yet," he prompted, his voice barely audible. "And yet I find myself caring for you in ways that make no sense." The admission felt like jumping from a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "In ways that would horrify my people if they knew." His arm tightened around her waist. "Your people are distant now. Mine are here. And among my people, a woman chooses her own path, follows her own heart. Even if that heart leads to a warlord who once held her captive. Especially then," he said with the ghost of a smile. "For such a woman has seen both his strength and his weakness, his cruelty and his kindness. She chooses with open eyes, not blind devotion." Without further words, he lowered his mouth to hers. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, a promise rather than a question. Celine responded without hesitation, her arms winding around his neck, careful of his injured shoulder. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, he rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured. Not as captive or servant, but as the woman who has claimed a warlord's heart. Her answer was to kiss him again, letting action speak what words could not fully express. Together they rose from the bench and moved toward his sleeping chamber at the far end of the longhouse, leaving behind the roles that had defined them until now, captor and captive, master and servant, Viking and Saxon. In the privacy of his chamber, illuminated only by a small oil lamp, they discovered each other anew. His touch was gentle despite the strength in his hands, reverent as he unlaced her gown and slipped it from her shoulders. She explored the landscape of his body with curious fingers, the hard plains of muscle, the scattered scars that told stories of battle survived, the unexpected softness of his beard against her skin. Their joining was neither conquest nor submission but a mutual surrender, a bridge across the chasm that had separated their worlds. In his arms, Selene found not the brutal raider of her initial fears but a man capable of tenderness, of passion tempered with respect. And in her embrace, Thorfinn discovered something he had never sought in his raids, a treasure that could not be taken by force but only given freely. Afterward, as they lay tangled in furs, her head resting on his uninjured shoulder, Selene confronted the reality of what had transpired between them. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Jida still expects to be your wife. Your people still expect that alliance." Thorfinn's fingers traced patterns on her bare skin, his touch thoughtful. "Politics can be rearranged. Jida's father values strength above all, and today, our combined forces crush the Danish threat. My position is stronger now than before. Strong enough to reject a valuable alliance," she pressed. "Strong enough to forge a different one." He shifted to look into her eyes. "The Danes will return eventually. Our settlements need unity, yes, but there are other ways to achieve it than through a marriage neither party truly desires." "Jida desires it," Selene pointed out. "Jida desires power," he corrected. "And she can find it elsewhere, with a man who will value her for herself rather than her father's ships." The practicality of his assessment was quintessentially Viking, Selene reflected. Among her people, marriages were often political arrangements, especially among the nobility, but rarely discussed in such frank terms. "And what of me?" she asked. "What place would a Saxon woman have among your people, one who is neither slave nor wife?" Thorfinn was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Who says you could not be wife?" The suggestion startled her. "A Viking warlord with a Saxon bride? Your people would accept this. My people respect strength, courage, and loyalty, all of which you demonstrated today." His hand cupped her cheek. "They also respect my judgment as their leader. If I choose you as my woman, few would question it openly, especially after you fought to defend our settlement. And those who would," she challenged. "Would face me," he said simply. "But I think you underestimate how you are viewed here, Selene. You have learned our language, observed our customs, worked alongside our women. You have shown respect for our ways while maintaining your own strength. These things matter more than where you were born." His confidence was compelling, yet Selene couldn't help but think of practical obstacles. "What of your gods?" "I was raised in the Christian faith. Many among us have accepted the white Christ alongside our old gods," he replied. "Some exclusively worship him now. I care more for how you live than which gods you honor." The casual religious tolerance surprised her, so different from the rigid doctrine she had been taught. Yet it aligned with what she had observed among the Norse, a pragmatic approach to spirituality that focused more on actions than beliefs. "And children?" she asked, voicing another concern. "Would they be Viking or Saxon? What would they be taught to believe?" Thorfinn smiled, clearly pleased by her mention of children. "They would be both, and neither. They would be themselves, born of two worlds, free to take the best from each." His expression grew more serious. "Is that not the future worth building? One where the children of Vikings and Saxons see each other as kin rather than enemies." The vision he painted was compelling, a future where the cycle of raid and reprisal might eventually end, where cultures could blend rather than clash. It was idealistic, perhaps, but no more so than the Christian teachings of universal brotherhood that had rarely prevented war between supposedly Christian kingdoms. It would not be easy, she said, though she found herself wanting to believe it possible. "Few things of value are," he agreed. "But I have never shied from difficult paths." His arms tightened around her. "The question is whether you are willing to walk this one with me." Selene closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. 6 months ago, she had been a merchant's daughter waiting in a monastery, her future as predictable as the changing seasons. Now she stood at a crossroads no one could have foreseen, offered a life among former enemies, a place of influence in a culture not her own, and love with a man who had once been her captor. It was madness by any rational measure. Yet when she searched her heart, she found not confusion but unexpected clarity. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, she had found something with Thorfinn that she had never expected, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting, a respect that had grown from initial fear, a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely soil. "Yes," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I will walk this path with you, Thorfinn Wolfson. Not as captive or prize, but as your chosen woman and equal." His smile was like the sun breaking through winter clouds, rare and radiant. He sealed their agreement with a kiss that promised both passion and partnership, a beginning rather than an ending. The winter that had brought war also brought transformation. As snow blanketed the northern landscape, healing the scars of battle, Selene's position within the settlement evolved from servant to respected companion of their leader. The transition was not without challenges. Jaida's fury at being set aside manifested in attempts to undermine Selene's standing, and some older members of the community grumbled about tradition and proper alliances. Yet these voices were increasingly drowned out by those who had witnessed Selene's courage during the Danish attack, who had benefited from her knowledge of healing, who had come to see her not as a Saxon captive but as a valuable member of their community. Thorfinn navigated the politics with the same skill he applied to navigation at sea. He offered Jaida's father an alternative alliance, joint trading ventures that would benefit both settlements without requiring a marriage neither he nor Jaida truly desired. He reminded his council of the advantages Selene's knowledge of Saxon customs and language brought to their trading efforts. And he made it clear, without explicit threats, that his choice of woman was not subject to community approval. As winter gave way to early spring, preparations began for the traditional thing, the assembly where legal matters were settled, disputes resolved, and major decisions formalized. It was here, Thorfinn explained, that he would formally declare Selene as his chosen woman, elevating her status from companion to something approaching wife. Not all will approve, he warned as they discussed the approaching assembly. But approval is not required, only acknowledgement. Selene had learned enough of Norse customs by now to understand the distinction. The community might debate and advise, but in matters of personal choice, the individuals will ultimately prevail. It was a form of freedom she had not expected to find in a society often dismissed by her people as barbaric. The night before the thing was to begin, Thorfinn presented her with a gift, a necklace of silver links interspersed with amber beads, from which hung a pendant combining Christian and Norse symbols, a cross superimposed on Thor's hammer. To honor both the worlds that made you, he explained as he fastened it around her neck. And to show others that such worlds can exist together. Selene touched the pendant, moved by the symbolism and the thoughtfulness behind it. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "And wise." "Wisdom comes easier with the right counsel," he replied, his fingers lingering at her throat. "You have taught me to see with different eyes, Selene. To question ways I once accepted without thought." The thing began the next day, with representatives from allied settlements joining the local community in the Great Hall. Matters of trade, land disputes, and criminal cases were addressed first, each presented to the assembly for judgment and resolution. When these practical matters had been settled, Thorfinn rose to address the gathering. Standing tall before them, his golden hair catching the light from the central hearth, he looked every inch the warlord whose reputation had spread beyond Norse territories. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried not command but conviction. "Many of you know that I have chosen a woman to stand at my side," he began, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "Some question this choice because she was not born among us, because her people have been our enemies, because her ways were not initially our ways." A murmur ran through the crowd, neither approval nor disapproval, merely acknowledgement of a controversial topic being addressed directly. "I say to you now what I would say of any choice that affects our people's future: judge by actions, not origins. Judge by loyalty, not lineage. Judge by the heart that beats within, not the land that gave birth." He extended his hand toward Selene, who stepped forward to stand beside him. She had dressed carefully for this moment in a Norse gown of deep blue wool, her hair partially braided in the local style but with Saxon elements woven through. The dual symbol pendant rested visibly at her throat. "This woman, Selene Jarrett, came to us unwillingly," Thorfinn continued. "Yet when Danish axes threatened our homes, she stood with us. When our wounded needed care, her hands brought healing. When counsel was needed on Saxon ways, her wisdom guided our decisions. He turned to face her directly, his voice softening though still audible to all. And when this warlord's heart sought a companion worthy of its devotion, she offered understanding no Norse woman could provide, the perspective of one who has seen both sides of our world and chosen to bridge them rather than break them. From the assembly, an older warrior with a grey-streaked beard rose to speak. Selene recognized him as Gunnar, one of the settlement's most respected fighters and a close advisor to Thorfinn. The Jarl speaks of choice, Gunnar said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Yet I would ask the Saxon woman directly, do you choose this path freely? Do you choose our ways, our people, our leader without coercion? It was a fair question, Selene acknowledged silently. One that she herself had wrestled with in the dark hours of night. Had she truly chosen Thorfinn, or merely adapted to captivity in the most advantageous way possible? Had she embraced Norse culture from genuine appreciation, or as a survival strategy? The answer came from a place deeper than calculation, a truth she had finally accepted within herself. I came to your shores as captive, she responded, her voice clear and steady. I remain as one who has found unexpected home. I have seen both the harshness and the honor of your ways. I have known both the warrior's strength and the man's tenderness in Thorfinn Wolfson. She touched the pendant at her throat. As this symbol joins different faiths, I choose to join different worlds, not abandoning what I was, but becoming something more through that joining. Her words were met with thoughtful silence, then a slow nod from Gunnar. Well spoken, he acknowledged. Though some may still harbor doubts. As is their right, Thorfinn interjected. I do not ask for universal approval, only for the chance to prove through time that this union strengthens rather than weakens our people. An unexpected voice joined the discussion, Hilda, who rarely spoke in formal assemblies despite her respected position in the household. I have watched this woman from the day she arrived, the older woman said, her weathered face solemn. I have seen her change from frightened captive to valued member of our community. More importantly, I have seen how she has changed our Jarl, tempered his impulses with thoughtfulness, broadened his vision beyond raiding to trading, shown him ways to lead that do not always require the sword. She looked directly at Selene. The gods brought her to us for a purpose, I believe. And that purpose may be to help forge a different future than the endless cycle of raid and revenge. Her words carried weight, coming from one known for pragmatism rather than sentiment. A murmur of consideration ran through the assembly. Other voices joined the discussion, some supportive, some questioning, some offering conditional acceptance dependent on future proof of loyalty. Through it all, Thorfinn stood firm beside Selene, his hand occasionally squeezing hers in reassurance. This was Norse democracy in action, she realized, messy, direct, sometimes confrontational, but ultimately respectful of individual choice while acknowledging community impact. Finally, when all who wished to speak had done so, Thorfinn addressed the assembly once more. I have heard your counsel, your concerns, your support. As is our way, I have listened to the wisdom of many voices. He paused, his expression resolute. And having listened, I declare before all gathered here that Selene Jarrett is my chosen woman, to stand at my side in peace and war, to share my hearth and counsel, to be honored as I am honored. He turned to Selene, taking both her hands in his. And I vow before these witnesses that you shall never again be captive or prize, but equal partner in all things. The declaration hung in the air, a challenge and a promise combined. Then, from the back of the hall, a voice called out, "Skål to the Jarl and his woman." The traditional toast was taken up by others, gradually spreading through the assembly until the great hall echoed with the sound. Not universal approval, perhaps, but acceptance, the Norse way of acknowledging that the leader's choice, once made, would be respected. That night, as they celebrated with food and drink and music, Selene found a quiet moment to step outside the great hall. The northern spring sky was alive with stars, and in the distance, the first hints of green were visible on trees long dormant under winter snow. Thorfinn joined her, draping a fur around her shoulders against the night chill. "Are you well?" he asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "I was thinking about the day your ships appeared at Lindisfarne," she replied. "How certain I was that it was the worst day of my life. How I prayed to be delivered from the Norse devils who had taken me captive." She looked up at him with a small smile. The gods have a strange sense of humor, it seems. Or perhaps they have wisdom beyond our understanding, he suggested, his arm slipping around her waist. Perhaps they knew what neither of us could, that sometimes the worst day can lead to the best life, if we have the courage to embrace it. Celine leaned into him, finding comfort in his solid presence. What happens now? She asked. Will you still lead raids against my homeland? It was a question she had avoided until now, fearing the answer might force her to confront contradictions she wasn't ready to resolve. Yet after today's declaration, it could no longer be ignored. Thorfinn was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant horizon. I have been thinking much about this, he finally said. About what you have shown me of Saxon ways, about alternatives to raiding that might bring equal prosperity with less bloodshed. Trading, she supplied. He nodded. Your father was successful at it, you said. And we have goods the Saxons value, furs, amber, walrus ivory. Perhaps. He hesitated, then continued more decisively. Perhaps it is time for a different approach. Not abandoning our strength, but directing it toward protection of trade routes rather than plunder of monasteries. The shift in thinking was significant, revolutionary, even, for a culture built around the glory of successful raids. Yet it aligned with changes Celine had already observed in Thorfinn's governance, a growing emphasis on sustainable prosperity rather than short-term gain, on building rather than simply taking. It would not be an easy change, she cautioned. Many of your warriors value the old ways, the glory of successful raids. Glory can be found in many forms, he replied. And change comes gradually, not all at once. Perhaps we begin with trading expeditions protected by warriors, showing that prosperity can come without sword edge leading the way. His lips quirked in a half-smile. Besides, you forget that Vikings are pragmatists above all. If trading brings more consistent wealth than raiding, with fewer losses of men and ships, many will adapt readily enough. His vision was both practical and hopeful, not a complete abandonment of Viking ways, but an evolution that might eventually lead to peace between peoples who had known only conflict. It was a beginning, a seed that might someday grow into something that would benefit both their worlds. I would help you with this, she offered. My knowledge of Saxon customs, of Christian sensibilities, could ease the way for initial contacts. I was counting on it, he admitted. You bridge our worlds in ways no one else can. Together, we might forge a path others will follow. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, the future more full of possibility than Celine could have imagined when she knelt in prayer at Lindisfarne all those months ago. From captive to companion to partner, her journey had been neither simple nor painless, but it had led her to this moment, this man, this opportunity to help shape a different future. Together, then, she agreed, sealing the pact with a kiss that promised partnership in all things, personal and political, private and public, heart and mind aligned in common purpose. As they returned to the celebration inside the Great Hall, Celine wore not just the dual-symbol pendant around her neck but also the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world, not where she had expected it to be, but where perhaps she had always been meant to find it. The Saxon captive had indeed become the Viking warlord's most treasured prize, not as possession, but as the unexpected gift of a love that transcended the boundaries of culture and conquest, pointing toward a future where former enemies might find common ground in the shared humanity that united them all.